Emily Parker pressed her small palms against the bakery window, leaving faint smudges on the glass as warm air rushed out every time the door opened. Inside, the place glowed like something out of a movie. Soft yellow lights, polished counters, and cakes lined up like celebrities on display. Chocolate towers with shiny frosting. Vanilla cakes wrapped in delicate flowers. Rainbow layers stacked so perfectly they almost didn't look real. Each one had candles ready to go. Emily turned 6 that day. 6 felt important. Old enough to count your own birthday candles. Old enough to make wishes. Old enough to understand when things didn't quite go your way. Behind her, Laura Parker knelt down on the cracked sidewalk, tugging her daughter a little closer. Laura's gray t-shirt was clean but faded, stretched thin from too many washes. Her sneakers had lost their shine years ago. Everything about her looked tired but careful. She always tried to look put together for Emily, even when life refused to cooperate. "I know, baby," Laura said softly, her voice low and apologetic. "I'm really sorry." Emily didn't cry. She never did when it mattered most. She just nodded, swallowing hard, her eyes still fixed on the cakes. "It's okay, Mom," she said, too calmly for a 6-year-old. "We have to pay rent first." Those words hit Laura harder than any tantrum ever could. Rent, the car repair, the electric bill. Double shifts at the diner that left her feet aching and her head foggy by midnight. Emily's father had been gone for 3 years now. No calls, no cards, no help. Laura carried everything alone, and most days she barely managed to keep it from spilling over. She wrapped an arm around Emily's shoulders, pulling her close. "Next year," Laura whispered, more to herself than to her daughter. "I promise." Emily gave the bakery one last longing look, her reflection blending with the glowing cakes behind the glass. Then she turned away, holding her mother's hand as they started down the sidewalk. Neither of them noticed the man standing a few steps back. He had stopped walking the moment he heard Emily's voice. The man watched them go. The small girl in a worn pink shirt, the exhausted mother holding herself together by sheer will. Something tight settled in his chest, sharp and familiar. A feeling he hadn't let himself touch in years. For the first time that day, Daniel Brooks was no longer thinking about meetings, money, or the party he was late for. He was thinking about birthdays that passed too quietly, and about the ones that never should. Laura kept walking even after the bakery lights faded behind them. She knew if she stopped, if she let herself look back, the guilt would hit harder than hunger ever could. Her grip on Emily's hand tightened just a little, not enough to hurt, just enough to remind herself they were still moving forward. The sidewalk was uneven, cracked from years of neglect, and the summer heat clung to everything. Laura felt it pressing against her skin, mixing with the dull ache in her feet. She'd been on her feet since dawn, refilling coffee cups and forcing polite smiles at strangers who barely looked up from their phones. Tips had been bad. The lunch rush had been slow. One table had walked out without paying. And still, she'd saved enough for groceries, just not enough for a cake. Emily swung their joined hands gently as they walked, humming to herself. That quiet little tune broke Laura's heart all over again. Most kids would have cried. Emily never did. She carried disappointment the way adults carried exhaustion, silently, carefully, like something fragile. "I can make pancakes tomorrow," Laura said, trying to sound upbeat. "Birthday pancakes, with extra syrup." Emily smiled, small but sincere. "That's okay, Mom. I like pancakes." Laura nodded, blinking fast. She hated how grown-up her daughter sounded sometimes. Hated that life had made her that way. They reached the bus stop, the bench hot from the sun. Laura sat, pulling Emily onto her lap like she used to when Emily was younger. She brushed a strand of hair from her daughter's face and kissed her forehead, breathing her in. Soap, sunshine, and safety. "I'm doing my best," Laura whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was saying it to. Emily, herself, the empty space beside them, where a second parent should have been. Emily rested her head against Laura's chest, listening to her heartbeat. "I know," she said softly. Across the street, traffic rushed by, loud and indifferent. Life didn't slow down for birthdays. It didn't pause for tired mothers or little girls without candles. But somewhere behind them, someone had stopped walking. And that small pause, quiet, unnoticed, was about to change everything. Daniel Brooks stood frozen on the sidewalk long after the traffic light changed. People brushed past him, annoyed, distracted, late for somewhere else. Normally, that would have been him, phone in hand, mind racing ahead to the next obligation. Tonight, he was supposed to be across town, walking into a private party filled with loud laughter, expensive gifts, and a cake that cost more than most people's rent. But his feet wouldn't move. He kept seeing the way the little girl had pressed her hands to the bakery glass, the way she didn't cry, the way she'd said, "We have to pay rent first," like it was the most normal thing in the world for a 6-year-old to understand. That sentence landed deep. Daniel let out a slow breath, his chest tight, his jaw clenched. He'd heard that tone before. Too calm, too accepting. He'd heard it years ago in his own kitchen, from a child who deserved so much more than silence and struggle. For a brief moment, he told himself to keep going. He had places to be, responsibilities, a schedule that didn't leave room for strangers and their problems. That's what he'd learned to do. Compartmentalize, move forward, don't look back. But something inside him pushed back. He turned and watched the mother and daughter sitting at the bus stop. The mother pulled the girl close, shielding her from the heat, from the noise, from a world that asked too much of people who already gave everything. There was exhaustion in the woman's posture, but also grit, pride, the kind that doesn't beg. Daniel's throat tightened. This wasn't pity, it was recognition. He knew that look. He knew that weight. He knew what it was like to carry a child through life when the person who promised to stay had walked away. He remembered missed birthdays, store-bought dinners, counting dollars instead of candles. Daniel checked his watch. Late. For the first time in a long time, he didn't care. He turned back toward the bakery, the bell over the door chiming as he stepped inside. Warm air wrapped around him, sweet with sugar and vanilla. The cake sat there, untouched, perfect, waiting. Daniel walked straight to the counter, his decision already made. Because years ago he'd needed someone to stop. And tonight, he realized, he had the power to be that someone. As Daniel stood at the bakery counter, his mind drifted backward, farther than he usually allowed. Back to a time when his life looked nothing like it did now. There had been a small apartment then, one bedroom, a leaky faucet he never quite fixed. Nights spent sitting at the kitchen table, staring at overdue bills while his son slept in the next room. Daniel remembered the sound of the door closing the night his wife left. No screaming, no dramatic goodbye, just a quiet final click that echoed longer than it should have. She'd said she couldn't live like that anymore. The uncertainty, the constant worry, the fear of never getting ahead. Daniel hadn't begged her to stay. He was too tired, too proud, too busy trying to figure out how to stretch $40 into groceries for a week. He worked whatever jobs he could find, warehouse shifts, delivery routes, weekend construction work that left his hands raw and his back screaming. Some nights he'd come home so exhausted he'd fall asleep still wearing his boots. He learned how to cook simple meals, braid hair with clumsy fingers, and smile through his fear when his son asked questions he didn't know how to answer. Birthdays were the hardest. There were years when a cupcake from the gas station had to count as cake. Years when Daniel sang happy birthday quietly, hoping his son wouldn't notice what was missing. He told himself love was enough. Sometimes it was. Sometimes it wasn't. Eventually things changed. A risk paid off. A business idea took hold. The money came faster than Daniel ever expected, but the memories never left. He just packed them away, buried under meetings and success and long days that left no room for reflection. Until now, until a little girl at a bakery window reminded him of everything he'd survived and everything he'd once needed. Daniel looked at the cakes behind the glass, his reflection staring back at him. He wasn't that man anymore, but he remembered him, and this time he could do something about it. The woman behind the counter looked up the moment Daniel stepped forward. She recognized him instantly. Most people did. His name carried weight in this city. Money, influence, expectations. "Can I help you?" she asked, professional but curious. Daniel nodded toward the display case without hesitation. His eyes locked on the largest cake there, a 3-tier masterpiece wrapped in smooth buttercream, trimmed with delicate piping and soft pastel roses. It was elegant, celebratory, completely out of place on an ordinary afternoon. "That one," he said. "I need it now." The baker hesitated. "Sir, that cake's for a wedding tomorrow. It took us days to make." Daniel didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply met her eyes, calm and certain. "I understand," he said. "I'll pay for that cake and whatever it takes to replace it. I just need this one." There was something in his tone, firm but grounded, generous without arrogance, that made the room fall quiet. The baker glanced at the cake, then back at Daniel, weighing rules against instinct. She nodded. As the staff carefully boxed the cake, Daniel reached for his wallet. The price didn't register. It never did. What mattered was the image burned into his mind. The small girl walking away from the bakery, her shoulders just a little too stiff for her age. When the box was sealed, Daniel lifted it carefully, as if it were fragile in ways that had nothing to do with frosting. The weight surprised him, not physically but emotionally. It felt heavier than it should have, loaded with meaning. He pushed open the door, the bell chiming brightly behind him. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the street. Daniel scanned the sidewalk, heart picking up speed. He spotted them half a block away, the tired mother and the quiet little girl, moving slowly, hand in hand. "Wait," Daniel called out, his voice carrying. "Please." They turned. And in that moment, standing there with a wedding cake in his arms, Daniel knew there was no turning back. Whatever happened next would matter. Laura turned the moment she heard the voice behind them. Instinct kicked in before thought. She pulled Emily a little closer, her body shifting protectively, eyes scanning the man walking toward them with a large white box in his arms. Well-dressed, confident, out of place. "We're fine," Laura said quickly, her tone cautious but polite. Life had taught her to be careful, especially with men who looked like they came from a world she didn't belong to. "I'm sorry," the man said, slowing his pace, keeping a respectful distance. "I didn't mean to scare you. I was in the bakery just now. I heard what your daughter said." Emily peeked out from behind her mother, curiosity winning over shyness. Her eyes drifted to the box. The man crouched slightly, lowering himself to Emily's level, his movements deliberate and gentle. "Hi," he said. "I'm Daniel." Laura didn't relax, not yet. Daniel lifted the box just enough for them to see the label from the bakery. "This is for you," he said, looking at Emily. "For your birthday." Emily's eyes widened. "For me?" Laura shook her head immediately. "No, we can't accept that. We don't even know you." Daniel nodded as if he'd expected the answer. "That's fair," he said evenly. "I'm not asking you to trust me right away. I just want to explain." He straightened, meeting Laura's eyes. Not with confidence, but with something quieter. Honesty. Familiarity. "I was a single dad once," he said. "My wife left when things got hard. Money was tight, really tight. There were birthdays I couldn't do right, no matter how much I wanted to." Laura felt the words hit somewhere deep. Too close. Daniel gestured lightly toward Emily. "When I heard her say she understood because rent came first, that stopped me. Kids shouldn't have to understand that much." Silence settled between them. The street noise faded into the background. Emily tugged gently on Laura's sleeve. "Mom?" Laura looked down at her daughter, at the hope she was trying so hard not to show, then back at Daniel. She searched his face for an angle, a condition, a reason to say no. She didn't find one. Her shoulders dropped just a fraction. "What's her name?" Daniel asked softly. "Emily," Laura said. Daniel smiled, small and sincere. "6 is important," he said. "I think it deserves a cake." Laura hesitated one last second. Then she nodded. And just like that, a simple sidewalk became the start of something neither of them could have planned. Laura's apartment was exactly 6 blocks away, just as she'd said. Daniel followed them inside after insisting on carrying the cake himself, holding the box steady like it mattered more than anything else he owned. The apartment was small, 1 bedroom, a narrow living room, a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people to stand in at once. The air was warm, thick without air conditioning, and a single fan rattled in the window, doing its best. But the place was clean, meticulously so. Emily's crayon drawings were taped neatly to the wall. Library books sat stacked on a milk crate by the couch. A chipped mug on the counter held wildflowers. Daniel noticed everything. Laura cleared the table quickly, moving aside the simple dinner she'd planned. Sandwiches wrapped in paper towels, apple slices in a plastic bowl. She felt suddenly self-conscious, aware of how small everything must look to a man like him. Daniel didn't comment. He simply set the cake down and smiled. "Do you have candles?" Laura laughed softly, embarrassed. I think I have a few." She found them in a drawer, mismatched and bent, but they worked. Emily watched wide-eyed as Daniel carefully opened the box. When the cake was revealed, her mouth fell open. "That's really mine?" she asked, barely above a whisper. Daniel nodded. "Every bit of it." They sang happy birthday together. Laura's voice shaky, Daniel's low and steady, Emily's bright and proud. When Emily blew out the candles, she squeezed her eyes shut tight, making a wish she refused to share. They cut the cake. It was sweet and rich, and far more than any of them were used to. Emily ate slowly, savoring each bite like she was afraid it might disappear if she rushed. Daniel leaned back, watching her laugh, frosting smudged on her chin. Something loosened in his chest. He hadn't realized how much he needed to see this. For a moment, the world outside didn't exist. There was just a little girl with a cake, a mother breathing easier than she had all day, and a man sitting quietly, knowing he was exactly where he was supposed to be. After the plates were cleared, and Emily disappeared into the bedroom to change into her pajamas, still humming, still glowing, Daniel stood and stretched slightly. "Would it be okay if I used your bathroom?" he asked. "Of course," Laura said, gesturing down the short hallway. The door clicked shut behind him. Daniel rested his hands on the sink for a moment, staring at his reflection. For the first time that night, his smile faded. The room was quiet, the fan humming faintly through the wall, the sound of Emily's laughter drifting softly from the other room. He pulled out his phone. The call was short, efficient. His voice stayed low, controlled, familiar in a way it hadn't been all evening. "I need this handled quietly," he said. "No names, no attention. Just make sure it's done right." A pause, then a single nod, even though the person on the other end couldn't see him. "Yes," Daniel added, "all of it." He ended the call and slipped the phone back into his pocket, taking one steadying breath before opening the door. When he returned, Laura was wiping the table, still visibly overwhelmed, like she was afraid the night might vanish if she stopped moving. Daniel watched her for a moment, how careful she was, how she carried herself with tired dignity. "Thank you," he said, "for letting me stay." Laura hesitated, then met his eyes. "Thank you," she replied. "You have no idea what this meant to her." Daniel glanced toward the bedroom, where Emily's voice floated out, telling an invisible audience about the cake. "I think I do," he said quietly. He didn't stay much longer. He said his goodbyes, crouched to Emily's level once more, and wished her happy birthday again. Then he stepped back into the warm night air. Daniel sat in his car for a long time before turning the key. He thought about the apartment upstairs, about the way Emily had smiled, about the years he'd spent believing survival was the only goal. Tonight reminded him of something else. Sometimes doing the right thing didn't end when you walked away. Sometimes it was only the beginning. The phone rang just after 9 the next morning, catching Laura in the middle of folding laundry. She almost ignored it. Unknown numbers usually meant bill collectors or robocalls, voices that never brought good news. "Ms. Parker," a man said when she answered. His tone was professional, almost cheerful. "This is the property management office. I'm calling about your rent." Laura's stomach tightened. Her fingers gripped the phone. I, I know I'm a few days early," she started, already preparing an apology. "That won't be necessary," the man interrupted gently. "Your rent has been paid in full for the next 12 months. Silence filled the room. "I'm sorry," Laura said. "There must be a mistake." "There isn't," he replied. "An anonymous donor took care of it. They also covered maintenance costs. We'll be repairing the bathroom leak this week and installing air conditioning." Laura sank onto the couch, the world tilting slightly. Who? Who did this?" "They asked to remain unnamed," the man said. "Just wanted you to know you're taken care of." After the call ended, Laura sat there for a long time, staring at the wall. Emily peeked around the corner, sensing something had changed. "Mom?" she asked softly. Laura pulled her close, tears finally spilling over. "It's okay," she whispered, though she didn't fully understand why yet. "We're okay." Over the next few days, more things followed. Quiet, orderly, almost unreal. A letter offering Laura a customer service job with steady hours and benefits. A technician showing up right on time. Groceries that suddenly stretched further than before. No one asked for thanks, no one explained. Late one evening, after Emily was asleep, Laura stood by the window and looked out at the street below. She thought of the man with the cake, the way he'd spoken, the way he hadn't promised anything. She didn't know how long the help would last. She didn't know why it had happened. But for the first time in years, Laura let herself breathe without counting the cost. Somewhere across town, Daniel Brooks read a brief update on his phone. Everything was moving smoothly. He locked the screen, set the phone down, and said nothing. That was the point. Time did what it always does. It moved forward quietly and without asking permission. Emily grew. Not all at once, but in small, steady ways. Her backpack changed. Her handwriting got neater. Her questions got bigger. The apartment stayed the same for a while, just cooler now, calmer. Laura came home earlier most nights, less worn down, more present. Dinner became something they shared at the table instead of something eaten in shifts. Emily noticed everything. She noticed her mom smiled more, that she slept through the night, that she laughed, really laughed, at things that weren't even that funny. Emily didn't fully understand why life felt lighter, only that it did. School became her favorite place. She loved the library best, the quiet rows of books that smelled like paper and possibility. Reading came easily to her. Words stuck. Stories mattered. Teachers started to notice. One of them wrote exceptional focus on a report card. Another said Emily had a natural curiosity that couldn't be taught. Emily took those words seriously. By middle school, she was staying after class to help younger kids sound out words. By high school, she volunteered at a small community center down the street, tutoring children who reminded her of herself. Quiet, observant, trying not to ask for too much. Sometimes when she walked past the old bakery downtown, she slowed without realizing it. The window looked the same. The cakes still sat perfectly under warm lights. Emily always smiled when she saw them. She never forgot that night. Not the cake. Not the man who brought it. Not the feeling of being seen when she hadn't expected anyone to notice. Laura watched her daughter grow with a mixture of pride and wonder. She suspected deep down who had set their lives on this new path, but she never said it out loud. Some gifts, she knew, were meant to stay unclaimed, and some moments were meant to ripple outward, shaping a girl into someone who knew exactly how much kindness could change the world. Emily was 17 the first time she saw him again. She was leaving the community center just before sunset, her backpack slung over one shoulder, her hands still smelling faintly of dry erase markers and paper. Inside, a group of younger kids laughed loudly, arguing over whose turn it was to read next. Emily smiled to herself. Moments like that always grounded her. A black sedan slowed near the curb. At first, she didn't think much of it. Cars passed all the time, but this one stopped. The door opened and a man stepped out, taller than she remembered, or maybe she was just smaller back then. His hair was streaked with gray now, his movements calm and unhurried. When he looked at her, something familiar settled into place. Emily's heart skipped. "It's you," she said before he could speak. The man smiled, surprised but warm. "Hi, Emily." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "I knew I'd remember you. My mom always said I would." Daniel Brooks stood there, hands loosely at his sides, like he wasn't sure what role he was allowed to play in this moment. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me," he admitted. Emily studied him, really studied him. The same steady eyes, the same quiet presence, the same way he looked like someone who carried stories he didn't talk about. "You brought me a cake," she said simply, "on the day I thought nobody would." Daniel exhaled slowly. "I didn't just do it for you," he said. "I did it because I knew what that kind of silence feels like." Emily nodded. "I figured." They stood there for a moment, the noise of the city humming around them. Then Emily smiled again, gentle, certain. "That night," she said, "did more than you think." Daniel met her gaze, his chest tight with something that felt a lot like gratitude. Some people walk into your life for a single moment, and somehow they never really leave. Emily's graduation day arrived under a clear blue sky, the kind that made everything feel possible. The school auditorium buzzed with proud families, camera flashes, and nervous laughter. Laura sat near the front, hands folded tight in her lap, her eyes shining before the ceremony even began. Daniel sat a few rows back. He hadn't planned to be noticed. He never did. But when Emily stepped up to the podium, tall, composed, confident, his chest tightened in a way no boardroom victory ever had. Emily looked out over the crowd, then began to speak. She talked about books and teachers and late night studying, about community centers and second chances, and then her voice softened. "When I was 6, she said, I stood outside a bakery window on my birthday. I didn't think anyone saw me. I thought that was just how life worked. You learn early, you accept less, and you move on." The room grew quiet. "But someone stopped," she continued. "Someone chose to see a tired mom and a quiet kid and decided that moment mattered. Not because it was big, but because it was human." Daniel felt Laura's hand find his. She didn't look at him, just squeezed once, grateful and steady. Emily smiled through the lump in her throat. That night didn't just give me a cake. It gave my family breathing room. It gave my mom dignity. It gave me a future, and it taught me something I'll carry forever." She paused. "Real wealth isn't money," she said. "It's what you do when you have the chance to help, and you choose not to walk away." The audience rose in applause. Daniel stayed seated for a moment longer, letting the sound wash over him. He thought about the man he used to be, the exhausted single father counting dollars instead of candles. He thought about the night he stopped walking, and he understood something, finally and completely. That small decision had saved more than one life. It had saved a piece of his own. Outside after the ceremony, Emily found him. She hugged him without hesitation, strong, grateful, unafraid. "You changed everything," she said. Daniel shook his head gently. "You did," he replied. "I just noticed." Before they parted, Emily asked a question she'd been holding on to for years. "If you hadn't stopped that night," she said, "who would I be?" Daniel smiled, thoughtful. "And if I hadn't stopped," he asked back, "who would I be?" So here's a question for you. How many moments like that have passed you by? How many times have you felt that quiet nudge to stop and kept walking? Because sometimes the smallest pause can change everything. If this story moved you, if it made you think, or if it reminded you that kindness still matters, subscribe to the channel. More stories like this are coming. Stories about real choices, real people, and the quiet power of doing the right thing when it counts. Thank you for watching. And don't forget, someone out there might be waiting for you to stop.